place you can send your prayer requests. You can send your prayer requests to Sandy Sanderson at that email address, and we'll be sending those around so you can be praying for each other. I'm seeing a lot of you already checking in. Good morning, Johan. I think that's Heine, Sandy, Steve, Peter, Dave, Jane. Oh wow, a bunch of people. Very cool. Hey, so it's good to be with you. This should be pretty interesting this morning. If you haven't checked in here, just do a little hello over there in the comments if you would. This should be interesting this morning because we're going to be in Romans chapter 13, and this is about a Christian's relationship to authority, specifically in this case, the government. In fact, let me just show you this quote from a commentary as we jump in here. It says that this passage, this Romans 13, 1 through 7, is the most notable passage in the New Testament on Christian civic responsibility. Now, I have to say, I've gone back and forth I miss you guys, so I wish we could be together. I've thought, if we were meeting in person on this, we would talk about, this would be it'd take us a month just to break down this passage with all the back and forth and questions. What I've tried to do is anticipate some of the questions and comments, and I'll look at them here. I'm going to do my best to keep my eye on the comments as well, so those of you that are streaming along live, I can see them, and I can try to address them as best I can. I'm looking at about literally 3 different screens here, so here's what I want to do. Flip to Romans 13:1, and then I'm going to have you go to 1 Peter in just a minute. But go to Romans 13. There's a parallel passage in 1 Peter that's going to be real important for us to note and for us to look at. All right. So here we go. Romans 13, and there it is, 1 through 7. Let me get out of the way here. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." This should be fun. Flip to 1 Peter chapter 2, and let me show you what's generally thought of as the main parallel passage to this text. I'm trying to copy and paste something. Nope, that didn't do it. I'm sorry, guys. 1 Peter chapter 2, and we'll start in verse 13. Sorry, here we go. 1 Peter 2, and we're in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. "Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people," meaning there's a blessing when we do this. I lost my place. "Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." And it would be more fun to talk about this in person. I'm posting an article that you can just have for future reference. I think I'm posting it. Yep. Let me try and summarize it, and then I'm going to read from it directly, because if you just look at this, the gist of it is about our relationship to the governing authorities as they've been established by God. Let me read you from this article that I just posted. "I'm not sure we grasp just how awful the ratings for Congress are and how long they've been that way." This is a CNN article. "From 1974, when the Gallup data starts, to September of 2009, the average approval rating for Congress in Gallup's polling was 37%. So one branch of our government, entire branch, 37%. But that 37% is more than double the 17% average approval rating Americans have given Congress since September of 2009. This article, I believe, is June of last year. Check me. Yeah, June of 2019. So it's been bad, and then it went to 17%. It's not just the average has been low, it's how consistent the low ratings have been. You have to go back 10 years in Gallup data to find a single poll in which Congress's approval rating was 30% or above. That's by far the longest stretch Congress has had a sub 30% approval rating since polling on this began. Prior to this latest run, the author, couldn't find a single stretch of 4 years or more in which there wasn't a Gallup poll in which Congress's approval rating was at least 30%. Then it talks about we have a decline of trust in government in general. According to the Pew Research Center, only 17% of Americans currently trust government always or most of the time. Only 17% trust the government always or most of the time. That's tied for a record low that also occurred in the last 10 years. Trust in the government's been on the decline since Vietnam. It's never been consistently this bad. Since 2008, there hasn't been a single poll in which the government trust in the government has reached 30%, which is by far the longest stretch for this skepticism. And listen to this. What's amazing is that neither Congress's approval rating nor trust in the government has rebounded in the past few years as the economy has gotten better. Shouldn't have been too surprising. Both measures fell below 30% and often 20% following the Iraq War and the financial crisis in the late 2000s. Usually, though, good economic times bring rise to both measures. But following dips in both measures during the first half of the 1990s, for example, they climbed back to greater than 40% during the dot-com bubble. Bottom line is this. Nobody trusts the government on either side of the aisle. And then the way we hear about politics and hear about what's going on is through the media. And I'll give you a few quick statistics about the trust in the media. Actually, this is the Washington Post just published an article recently. This would have been a couple weeks ago, I believe it was. The news media had the worst approval rating of all major American institutions grappling with the coronavirus. This is the first sentence of their article. The Washington Post says the news media has the worst approval rating, and they've included themselves in that. 44% approve of the media's handling of the coronavirus. Now, one of the things that it says in that article is it says that, and I'm not trying to, well, whatever. So it says that Republicans bring that trust in the media low because if those who said they're Republican only trust the media 25%. That means 1 out of 4 people who say they're Republicans actually trust the media. And then they go on to say how the Democrats bring that trust in the media up to 68 point something, 69 basically percent. Meaning that on one half of the aisle, 1/3 of them still disapprove of the media and still don't trust it and still don't think they're doing a good job, and they are bringing the percentages way up. In fact, we are so skeptical of the media and the news and even statistics that you're probably going, well, where did you get those statistics? All right. So listen, excuse me. We don't trust politicians. We don't trust the media. And I probably didn't even need to give you a survey of any kind to prove it. I'm going to post another one down here that you can look at some Gallup research. This is one of the reasons why most people think that Donald Trump is our president, because he just talked about draining the swamp and those politicians that are already there and talk negatively about him. He talks about fake news and the corrupt media, and it's resonating with people because there's so many of us that don't trust politicians and don't trust the media. And then at the same time, we've got, as Christians, we've got these kinds of mandates by Paul, by the Holy Spirit, so they're by God, about how we submit to the governing authorities. So how do we do that in a time where if any president, if their approval rating hits 50%, we're celebrating how, oh, wow, 50%, that's great, and that's high. What do we do? So let me be real open here about this and give my 2 cents. I don't do politics. I hate politics. Politics has positioned itself, even Christians in politics, as as the answers to the problems that we have. I don't like that. Even Christian politicians have started saying that they give that politics is the answer to what ails us, or they push mankind is going to be the answer to what ails us. Instead of, as a Christian, I fundamentally disagree and say politicians are not the answer. Perhaps God working through anybody, but maybe some in that role. But that's not the answer. That's not where my hope is. And I sure as heck don't look around and go, I'll just trust my fellow sinful man that everything will be fine. I only trust God working through these different institutions and through these different groups. I'm going to post some cross references here where it says, and Kevin, I see your comment here about John MacArthur, but make a note of that too. CF is a Latin term that means just confer. It's the nerdy way of saying here's some cross references here that you can look at. But it is, it's going to be easy this morning to be negative. If we were in the room together, it would be easy to just take shots at the government. I'm wondering a couple things as I'm trying to have sympathy for some of these people, because theoretically people would get into these kind of roles out of humble reasons, although I don't think that that's the case for many of them probably. But I might give Congress a low approval rating, and I don't know how many of them I could even name, let alone do I actually know them. So I do want to be careful and think there's a system that we have here that may not be that may be conducive to it. When we keep seeing the same things happen over and over, we need to go, hey, there's probably a system problem here. And then secondly, I do wonder if are there some great people in Congress, in the executive branch, on the Supreme Court, and not just national level, think local level as well, that just get lumped in with politicians and may hate it? Or are there people that would be willing to step into these roles but won't because of how negatively we talk about politicians, and they go, no, thank you. I don't want that for me, for my family, anything like that. Forget that. And so we sort of make people, in a sense, not do that. So I want to be careful this morning about taking cheap shots. Let's look at this text together, please. Let's look at, he says, be subject. I'm sorry. That was a First Peter one that we looked at. I don't even know if I read that. I did. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, be it to the emperor as supreme or the governors as sent by him to do evil and to praise those who do good. For it's the will of God that by doing good, you can stay in Romans, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. That's talking about a witness we have when we live in this way. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Now here's how he starts out in Romans. He says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. When he says be subject to, now we're gonna jump into something here a little bit. It's the word hupo and tasso. Hupo is it's very popular root in the Greek in the New Testament. Hupo means the idea of being under, and tasso is command or order or a directive. And so this is there's no like Greek way of getting around this. This is put yourself under the governing authorities, put yourself under their commands, orders, directives, and be subject to them. Let me just read you from this commentary. To those to whom submission must be rendered are called, and it says here, governing authorities. And there's two different words. The first one for governing is exousia. It's not a real specific term. It's a general term of authorities. And the second one is archon. Josephus uses it. Paul uses it with reference to the Roman rulers, especially in that time. So there's not a way of getting around that. He is telling the Romans there, the Roman citizens, be subject to the Roman authorities, the governing authorities where you live. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And then he gives the reason for it. There's no authority except from God. And he repeats himself essentially. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Okay, let's chat for just a moment here, because the first thing that people do is when they say, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, they think, well, not every governing authority. I mean, think about Genghis Khan. Think about, or here's the one everybody likes to do. Think about Hitler. What about Hitler? So you're saying that you should be subject to Hitler if he was the ruling authority in the time because, hey, he was instituted by God. He was the authority from God. Those that exist have been instituted by God. That seems to be what it's saying. This is why some Christians right now are saying, well, we live in Colorado. I don't have to listen to Governor Polis because I don't think he's a Christian. Or Donald Trump doesn't have enough Christian character to be worthy of my allegiance and my following. So they, because I deem them to fall outside of whatever parameters I've created of someone that's worthy to be followed, they fall outside. Therefore, I not only don't have to do what they say, I don't have to honor them. I can get on Facebook and rag on them. I can talk about them with my friends about what idiots these people are. And that's my big hesitation. And as we talk about this, and think if we were together, you know there'd be some things flying around, guys. But that feels like Hitler is usually the trump card used here to go, see, this obviously must mean something else because you don't submit yourself to somebody who's a horrible leader or a horrible institution, maybe would be the way to think of it, because there's rarely just one person. It's all sorts of people in the chain. Now, you don't really need to think of a negative example, though, and I'll tell you what I mean. He is writing this to Christians that are under the Christian persecution that Nero brought. Nero is the one, if you recall, Claudius right before him is the one that expelled the Jews from Rome. Nero sort of went, hey, you can come back, sort of, but not really, and let some of them come back. If they were Christians, he started literally killing them. Basically made a lot of the Jews and Jewish Christians stay out, which just became how the gospel spread. But he made them stay out. But then he's the one, if you remember this whole thing of he needed the allegiance of the nation, so he started burning Rome, and he played an instrument. We say fiddle. It's usually not a fiddle, but he's playing something up on like a balcony, looking out and seeing Rome burning that he set the fires to. And then what happened is he needed an enemy that he could rally the nation around so he could be the savior of it. And so what did he do? He said, Christians did this. So he turned the people against Christians. He turned his leaders against Christians. He had absolute sway and authority. And so he was this emperor. So he started killing and murdering Christians. And here's Christians, the Roman Christians meeting in the church. And Paul says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So the question we come to is, what if? And I see what Myron wrote there. He says the Bible has a note, we should never allow the government to force us to disobey God, and that's absolutely right. Let me give you a couple examples, and if you want to write these cross-references, sorry I don't have them quickly enough to put them up here, but in Exodus, you have, actually, why don't you flip there? Let's do that. Exodus 1:15. Exodus 1:15. This is the king of Egypt and what the king of Egypt did. He said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shipra and the other Puah, excellent names. Verse 16, Exodus 1:16, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, so they are giving birth. If it's a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. Now, these people obviously, and it says in a minute, they feared God. This is something that would be reprehensible to God. But we have this thing, and this one's a pretty clear-cut one, where it's should you murder innocent children or be obedient to God? And in verse 17, he says, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Go to Daniel 3. Daniel 3. So what did these midwives do? They said, I will normally submit myself to the authorities. When they ask me to do something that falls outside the will of God, I won't do it. And if need be, I'll pay any price. Why? Not because they're just good moral people, and that's important to understand. It says they feared God. Daniel chapter 3. I'll start in verse 8, I guess. At that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. This is under the Persian rule. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of all those instruments shall fall down and worship the golden image. In verse 11, whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar had said, fall down and worship this idol, and if you don't, the punishment is death. Verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, this is Daniel 3:13, in furious rage commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought, meaning brought before him. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the blah-blah-blah and every good music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? The emphasis there is out of my hands. I am the powerful king. I am telling you to do something, and it is you fall down and you worship somebody who is not me, who is not God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, this is good, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. We have no need to answer you in this matter. They're saying we are not ultimately accountable to you. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Think about what they just said. They said, we believe that God will deliver us if we're faithful to him. But they add a very important caveat, which is, he might not. Even if we were to die, though, we are followers of, let's say Christ in the Old Testament, Yahweh, God. We are followers of God, and we will pay any price. In Acts chapter 5, you don't need to turn there. If you want to go back to Romans 13, you can. That's where we're going to be. But in Acts chapter 15, there's a really great cross-reference in here. I might be able to copy and paste it pretty quickly here. Hang on just a sec. Yep. This is Acts 5:29. Acts 5:29, but Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. What he's saying in that moment, the leaders are meeting with them, and they're saying, you got to quit speaking about Jesus. And it says, Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Meaning God's command and yours are coming in conflict, and we've already decided which one we're going to follow. So let me give you first a few black and white things. The reason, by the way, that churches are tax exempt is the very reason is so that the government can't impose on churches what to teach and preach and believe. That's the reason. Now, we do have some political candidates, and I won't say who, but they're taken seriously by many, like legitimate shots at being, in fact, there's some senators right now that even echoed this, that said that the big one was if a church wouldn't perform a same-sex wedding, they should lose their tax-exempt status. Let me take a slightly different topic, because there's some laws about polygamy before about 4, I think now, different state senates or Congress, whatever they are. I don't even know where they are. They're in different places. I don't understand. But in my hopefully 20 or so more years that I have in Colorado as a preacher, if God wills that I get to stay here that long, I will personally, I bet you, face this. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point some guy wants to marry 3 women. And I don't know if that'll happen here or not. But let me just say, if we lose tax exemption, if we get blasted in the media for standing for what is true, if I get personally blasted for it, if we lose our tax exempt and people don't maybe give some big donations here, we lose money, we're not able to do as much ministry, we need to be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as a church and say, I will pay any price. I am not going to compromise one bit. And if the government says you must do this or else, and what you must do falls in conflict with what the Bible teaches, then I will take the or else. And to be quite frank, Nikki and I had to have that conversation before we came here. Are we willing to pay any price? If somebody says, okay, the Bible says X is right, and then the government says you can't preach that that's right, or you go to prison, then I may end up in prison. I hope not. I mean, there's some that are very black and white like that, and the examples I gave are pretty black and white. But let me give you some gray areas, and I'm not going to give you a whole lot of answers here. Schools that are teaching right now this, it's called Growing and Changing. It's all about your bodies and sex and normalizing and all sorts of sexuality that's apart from what God says. They teach that in the schools. Right now they say if you don't want to do it, here's what's happening, and you can see all the curriculum. You can take a kid out if you want. We take our kids out. With Hannah, we were the only family at Ralston Elementary. They're doing an elementary now that took kids out. What if the government didn't give the option to do that? Is that absolutely take them out and pay any price, or lie and say they're sick, or tell them the exact reason why, something like that? Or is that a gray area of, you know it's coming, they're going to talk about it, and your job as a parent is to equip them at home. So don't rebel and take them out, just teach proper sexuality at the house. That's a bit of a gray area. We're shut down now as a church, and I believe there's people that don't fully have a deep theology and understanding of the value and what it means, the mandate for Christians to be gathering, I want to say this carefully, to be gathering that are making these decisions. So is there ever going to be a point where the church needs to say, I understand, we're going to meet anyway? So a church in Colorado Springs did that. Actually, a church right over here did it. The church right over here behind me, you don't even know where I'm pointing, the church behind me that did it, a very charismatic church, said, God will keep us safe. It was basically, we just answer to God, and they felt like it was the government saying you are not allowed to meet as a church, and they felt they would be in sin to not meet, and so they are meeting. And they are getting blasted by the community on Nextdoor and Facebook and all that kind of stuff for meeting. They don't care about the culture. They don't care about the area, that kind of a thing. And it's funny. It's a gray area. We would not shut down out of fear. We would if it was wise. And that's the only reason we're doing it. And I can tell you, for me, this is very personal for me here. If I was going to do anything personally, that's one thing. If I was gonna have to do something on behalf of Rockland, we are opening up now. I can't foresee going against what the government says without the blessing of the elders, because God would, I believe, in that kind of a matter, God would speak through these other, through godly leaders that have been appointed by Him in the church. But I am speaking to you today as someone who, and hopefully I get another 20 or so years here, there will be some kind of legal governmental interference where there will be personal cost. And even if it's like a church-wide cost as the pastor, that's my livelihood. That's definitely let me try it like this. I'm going to try the built-in microphone. Thank you for posting that. I just said a whole bunch of really brilliant things, by the way, so you would have been really moved. All right, hang on. Sorry about that. Let me go on to verse 2 here. Whoever resists, what I said a minute ago, in case you didn't hear it, is just that we are in a place where there will be, for me personally, some kind of governmental interference, some kind of personal cost that I'll have in my career, for lack of a better term, here at Rockland. And I am willing to pay that price. And I hope wherever you are, when God's will comes in conflict with what the government is telling us to do, that we would say, first and foremost, I submit to God. All right, there we go. Now it's back. Now, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Whenever we rebel against a ruler, we are rebelling against God. One of the things that I found is those who tend to resist authority in general, like really take shots at authority, like politicians or presidents or whoever it is, tend to be bad at just submitting to authority in general. I used to teach parents all the time. There was one time, I may have told you, I caught a kid with a cell phone on a retreat, and he wasn't supposed to have a cell phone. And I said, "Oh, you're not supposed to have this." And he said, "My mom said I could have it, but not to get caught." And I thought, okay, I wasn't born yesterday. So I said, "Give me your phone." I pick up the phone, I call his mom, and I say, "Hey, I'm here with your son." And he said, "He's got a cell phone. He said that you told him to have it, just not get caught." And she goes, "Yeah, I told him not to get caught." And I thought, oh, man, are you kidding me? And what happened was she thought that she was going, hey, there's a rule that says don't have your cell phone. I'm telling you, don't worry about following that. She was just teaching me, don't worry about following that one rule that you have there. What she was really doing was teaching him authority is optional. That kid had tons of authority issues later on. And I felt really dumb having to apologize to him, I'm sorry, you're in an impossible position. But generally, we rarely just have a negative view of one authority. It's generally a broad-based, we dislike authority. Start watching any movie and you'll see the authority figure is the bad person, unless they rebel against the other authority figures and don't play by the rules and don't follow the mandates that are handed down to them from those in authority. Now, when it says here, this is a little bit of a tricky one. The word judgment is the word krima, and krima is used a couple. That's beautiful writing. Krima is used a couple different places. It has a double meaning. Those who resist will incur judgment, will incur some kind of judgment from those authorities, but it's also used multiple times. In fact, in Romans it is. Romans 2:3 it says, "Do you suppose, O man, that you who judge, you practice those things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the krima of God," the judgment of God? So what he's saying is there's judgment that comes from the people that God has given us, these authorities, and then also there is the ultimate judgment of God on us. What he's saying here is if you resist the authorities that God has appointed, it is so closely tied to an understanding of who you are, of your submission to God, that it says, are you a believer? Should you fear the judgment of God? Do you have forgiveness in Christ? Do you submit to God? And then what comes next is one of the most difficult things, because you ever sat on the phone and you've just heard one half of the conversation? Let me look. Some people are still having sound issues. I'm sorry. Check. It shows that I'm broadcasting, so I'm going to keep going here. If you only hear one half of the conversation, you don't get the full picture. And what he's going to say next is very difficult because it only gives one half of the coin. He is saying to the people, this is how you submit to rulers. And it doesn't say, hey, rulers, here's what you're supposed to do. But look what it says. It says, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Rulers are there to govern to govern our society. As much as we complain, we're safer than most people, but they are trying to govern sinful, broken humanity. And when it says that he can bear the sword, it says he doesn't bear it in vain. It means that the government has the authority to punish. Now, this goes as far, when it says bear the sword, it goes as far as to say the death penalty could be part of it. I don't want to get into a big thing here and how it's executed and all that. This gives biblical permission, meaning the government is the authority by God that could execute that kind of a judgment for the good of society. And then where the discussion comes in is it for the good of society or not. So let me keep going so you can get madder. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. We submit ourselves to our leaders because it shows our submission to God. Or that idea for the sake of conscience. I just talked with my kids about clear conscience living, what it means to live with a clear conscience. If dad walks in your room and you have to close your laptop real quick because you were chatting or you were watching Netflix and you're supposed to be doing your homework or whatever it is, that's not clear conscience living. It's not clear conscience living if you're flying down the freeway and you see a police officer and you go, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, and you got to slam on the brakes and you're going, oh, please don't see me, please don't see me, please don't turn on your lights, please don't turn on your lights, looking in the rearview mirror. We live with a clear conscience as Christians when we submit to the governing authorities. And then he talks about taxes. For because of this, I am going to make comments on this. I'm going to get through it and then come back. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. And then he said, so you're going, wait a minute, give taxes to this Roman machine? That's what he's going to say. Because of this, you pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Then he says, pay to all what is owed them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. This echoes the words of Jesus when they say, should we pay taxes? And they're trying to trick him. And he says, give to God what is God's and give to Caesar what is Caesar's. What do we do if we're stewards of God's resources, which we are, and then we're supposed to give to a government? Like right now, think about paying taxes. Our taxes are basically going to pay off we're not really paying off the national debt. It may go to things that we disagree with. What do we do in those circumstances? Well, one of the things that's happening here is Paul is saying, if you owe taxes to these governing authorities, and the general principle is that they govern you and they are for your good, we'll talk about in a second. If that's the principle, your job is we pay taxes to them. They are appointed by God. They are there by God. We need to trust God's sovereignty over them. But that doesn't really help because we have corrupt leaders sometimes. We have some causes that money could go to that's just plain, some may be unbiblical, but more than that, not more than that, some may be horrible use of money. Like if we're going, we are stewards of the resources that God has given us, how can we possibly give it to the government? In fact, as a pastor, I have some tax exemptions, and there's this big, I think I shared this, there's this big debate about should pastors be tax exempt or not. If you pay money and it goes to like fund the military, for example, and you're a pacifist, which I'm not, but if you're a pacifist and so you have a conscientious objection, you can opt out. If you have a conscientious objection to anything about government, healthcare, Medicare, kind of stuff, you can opt out. I can't really get there. So I have pastor friends that say, well, of course you shouldn't opt out if you don't object to it. That's what it's there for. And some that say, no, you can and you get more money and you're a steward of God's resources. So what I ended up doing, I wrote a letter to the IRS and said, I'm not really sure. I would like to opt out for obvious reasons. Here's my convictions. And I wrote my honest convictions. And I said, if this doesn't qualify, I understand it. If it does, thank you. And I got something back that says qualified, and I went, and it was stamped, and I went, great, clear conscience, and I pay taxes, but there's certain Social Security is the issue that I'm exempt from. We pay taxes. I do pay taxes, though, to the government, and I think if we were going to if we were going to give the government a grade of how they spend the money, how are they doing as stewards of God's resources, that's where the frustration kicks in. So what is Paul trying to say here? And it's really important to understand because one is Paul trying to say this is normative. This is what the government should be doing. That's possible. The other possibility is he said in Romans 8:28 about all things work together for good, that God has a plan for ultimate good even from corrupt leaders, from corrupt institutions. And he's saying don't take matters into your own hands. Meaning, I'm not trusting in politics to save the problems in politics. Or I'm not going to have a little bit of sin in my life in order to overthrow a greater sin. Like I'm not going to become a news anchor or more realistically like a blogger type thing and spread misinformation that might ultimately have a biblical end, a good end, but to do it in a way that compromises my integrity. To be faithful, what Paul would have said to the early Christians, be faithful in the midst of horrible, oppressive authority in your life. Now, I told you a minute ago, this is what I want to wrap up with. I told you a minute ago that when we look at this, we're hearing one side of the conversation. I mentioned this a long time ago. We're going to go back to the beginning of chapter 13. I mentioned this a long time ago when we started this study in Romans, and I've alluded to it periodically. Nero hated Christians. Nero was killing Christians. Paul is one of the big, well-known spokespeople, the church planter for Christians. Nero no likey Paul, all right? He hated him. Paul wrote a bunch of letters to people throughout the Roman Empire. I want to read this again with this lens, that Paul is writing this knowing that Nero or somebody very close to him would have seen it. In other words, Paul is not just teaching the Roman Christians. He is making a comment about the nature of authority that Nero himself needs to hear. All right, hear it again. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, or it says be subject to that's 2 Peter. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. I was wondering why it said that. If I'm Nero, I'm going, Christians, do what I say. Then he says there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. He continues, therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. What he just said to Nero is, you sit on a throne because the very God that you oppose put you there. This is smack talking to Nero is what's happening. He is saying, yes, Nero, you're there, and yes, Christians, you're supposed to submit to the authorities as long as they don't conflict with what God says. But Nero, you sit on that throne because someone who is higher than you, I know you can't picture anybody higher than you, Nero, somebody higher than you has stewarded you with this responsibility of leading the nation. Rulers are not a terror of good conduct, but to bad. Your job is not to get the good people, Nero, and terrorize them, but the bad people. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Do what is good, and you will receive his approval. The people that are doing good should have your approval, Nero, for he is God's servant for your good. Nero thought he served nobody. And what happened? Paul just said, you are a servant. You are a slave, Nero, of Almighty God. Let me just look real quick. He is God's servant is the word diakonos. It's not the word used for slave. It's really a servant, though, someone who is a doer instead of a authoritative leader in a sense. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Nero would have thought, my job is to carry out my wrath. My job is to keep the peace in the way I want it to be kept. And what Paul is reminding him of is, you sit on the throne because God put you there. You're his servant. You are doing his will. That is what you are supposed to do. And he says, because of that, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you pay taxes. He says the reason you pay taxes, the reason these Christians pay taxes, is not because of you, Nero, because you're so powerful or you're so full of terror. The issue is you are a minister of God, and this is your calling. So pay to all what's owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed. Listen to this, revenue to whom revenue is owed. This is a good translation. Respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Can you imagine reading all this as Nero, thinking you are God on earth, and then Paul says, you are a servant of God on earth, and he has appointed you. You didn't get there because you're crazy and you killed all these people and you manipulated and you've got this bloodline that does all this. You are there because God has put you there, and this, as a reminder, is to be your role. And I'm instructing Christians to say, pay taxes. If you owe taxes, pay it. If you owe revenue, pay revenue. Respect those that are owed respect, and honor those that are owed honor. Now, let me close with this. One of the reasons this is difficult, and this may be the whole thing that we need to take from this, when we talk in our culture today about being under the authority of somebody else, and I count 4 different instances. There's a few more than that, but there's 4 instances that are very clearly tied that use very similar language. That you have rule over, dominion over, or authority over, or we're in submission to. I count 4 different examples. Well, number 1 is man to creation in Genesis 1. He says you have dominion over the earth. One is this one here in 1 Peter 2. He rattles off 3 right in a row, governing authorities over those who govern. The next one he says is he talks about masters to slaves. And then he says one that these two are not, well, none of these are popular in our culture. He talks about husbands and wives. He uses the same language, hupotasso. Wives, submit to your husband, and the husband's ahead of the wife. He's using that same kind of language, and he's using the same language when he uses masters to slaves, governing authorities to those that they govern. Here's why, that's obviously very offensive in our culture, which I don't really care about. But here is, when you think of a biblical view of authority, here it is. You have a rule, in a sense, over, you have a leadership capacity over, and you have a stewardship of whatever that thing is. So what he's saying in Romans is he's saying the governing authorities that sit there and beat their chest and say, we get to do whatever we want. You didn't ascend just for your good. You ascended for the good of the people that you have authority over. Husbands, you don't rule with dominion over your wife. You love her as Christ loved the church. Masters to slaves. In that this was radical in the culture, how Paul talked about it. In the culture, it was masters beat your slaves. If they die, darn, because you lost some money, and that was it. And Paul, when he uses the language of slaves submit to your masters, there's an understanding that he's saying, masters, when you have your slaves, you don't treat them like everybody else does. They're basically employees. They're hired hands. There were things set up so they could be freed after a certain period of time. And when he says mankind rules over the beasts, the earth, the trees, all that kind of stuff, it's the idea that we steward and we care for the planet that God has given us. And what he's telling Nero is you have been put in this place of authority for that very reason. To steward your authority, not to rule over and just get what you want, use people as pawns to get what you want, which is what he was doing, but to steward this opportunity to bless and to care for them. This plays over into our everyday life in many ways. If you have leadership, if you have authority over somebody, I'd encourage you to not view it the way the world does, but to view it in a way that says, I am responsible, in a sense, for them. I want to bless them. The kids in your life are not there just to make you happy. The kids are there. You're stewarding the time that you have with them to raise them to be disciples of Jesus Christ. The people that report to you in your business, oftentimes we go, well, I want to do this, and so you guys need to do what I want. We are in a time, we bless those. God has given us leadership as a stewardship, and the authority we have, we leverage for the good of other people. God is higher than Nero. God is higher than Trump or whoever our next president is going to be. He's higher than whatever Supreme Court justices or their combined effect. He's higher than all of them. And so this is why Christians can live saying we will submit to authority that God puts in our life because we submit to God. If this authority tells me to do something that's out of line with what God says, I will ignore this authority and I will pay any price. And for anybody that's in a place of leadership, you are there because God has appointed you and God has put you there. Don't waste it as an opportunity to worship Him and to bless others. So God, as we wrap today, we come to this time with this most difficult time where we have such low trust in those people that we're supposed to have trust in. It appears that so many have forgotten you and moved from you. And Father, we have it nothing like the early Christians did to whom this letter was written. May we have this perspective in all we do. I pray for these men that any leadership position they have, that they would not use it as an opportunity to lord over anybody, but remember that they have been given that as a sacred trust by you, and we would steward that well. God, help us use our gifts, our resources, our talents, our leadership for your good. And we thank you for Christ and what he did, that though he was God on earth, he didn't consider, it says in Philippians, equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant. And that he went to the cross on our behalf. And if he didn't claim his right as God to not have to do that, may we not think of ourselves more highly than we ought either. God bless these men today in these times. Pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thanks, gentlemen.